Well, it's really good to see you and to be together in one room, which has been something we've all been missing. I know we've been doing it this last year, but it still gives us a lot of sense of community, which is, I think, what we're going for tonight. Although I can already hear a pin drop, I just wanted to start by saying that it is a Quaker practice at things like this, gatherings like this, to begin with a moment of silence. And I want to borrow that tradition, that practice, given the topic of today, to just take a few moments and be very quiet. Thanks. Well, thank you. My name is Will Hitchcock. I teach in the history department, and I also run a little program called GAGE, Governing America in a Global Era, which is one of the organizations that's made this possible. I want to start just with a few thank yous. I want to thank Manuela Achilles for nudging us all to do this. She really got the idea rolling. I want to thank all 6 panelists who are busy people for spending some extra time and giving us their expertise. They know a lot about what's going on. They have different kinds of expertise, so we'll be hearing different sorts of voices from different special fields. I want to thank a Zoom audience, which has 183 people watching it, which is about as many people as are in here, which is great. Thank you all for coming and joining. And thank you for coming physically here to be together and talk about this terrible time. Look, we're all in a bit of a state of confusion, I think. We're trying to come to grips with very difficult scenes that we are becoming acquainted with, cities and towns in Ukraine that are being shelled by missiles and artillery and gunfire. We're trying to figure out how this war began. We're trying to figure out how it might end, and there are all sorts of scenarios for that. We're trying to figure out something, especially those of us who are not specialists. We're trying to learn something about Ukraine and its history, its culture and languages and its people, its place in Europe. It may be that a week ago, some of us had never really thought much about Ukraine, and suddenly we find ourselves deeply invested in it. We're also trying to adapt to the incredible, remarkable response of the international community to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The speed with which Europe, the United States, and many other countries have reacted and responded is actually amazing, surprising, unpredicted. This is something of real note that we're going to talk about. The war has already changed Europe. It's changed many European institutions. It has changed the attitudes and opinions of millions of Europeans overnight. It's had a dramatic impact in Europe. I believe it's also changed attitudes and opinions here in the United States on a range of issues. So Europe, America, the world, we are all in the midst of change. I also just want to end with this, and then I'm going to introduce our amazing group of faculty speakers. This conflict matters to us here right now in ways that maybe we don't know how to articulate. But why are we all here? What is it that we really care about? What is it that has motivated us to come here? I'm not sure, but let me give you a way of thinking about that. You guys, students, you've seen some things since about 2001. The world has been a very difficult, scary place. And once again, this difficult world doesn't fail to deliver. But what it has given, the war in Ukraine has given us is a moment where maybe we see things with clarity, a degree of clarity that we are unused to seeing. Maybe this conflict is actually showing us what it really looks like when a war of dictatorship and kleptocracy is launched against a people that is actually defending personal liberty, freedom, and democracy. Now, there are going to be questions about that framing, but that, I think, is what we're all really responding to. A sense of immediacy, a sense of freedom and democracy actually being under siege right now at this very hour. And I, for one, feel that that is what is at stake here. I think we all feel somehow invested in what's happening because of the high stakes. So ask yourselves tonight, after this is all over, that was really cool, that was interesting, I learned a lot, but what am I doing? What can I do to defend tolerance and democracy and freedom and liberty in my own community here? What can I do and what am I willing to give? What am I willing to give? That's what Ukrainians are being forced to answer tonight. And I hope we can all reflect a little bit on, if we want to share in their sacrifices, what do we have to give as well? All right, without further intro or comment from me, I want to turn over to our panelists. Here's how this is going to go. Each of them is going to speak for just a few minutes, but I think it'll be substantive, give you a lot of food for thought. And then, to the extent that we can, we're definitely going to do plenty of Q&A. We have mics, and I am and my colleague Ian will be running around giving you the mics to speak. I'm going to ask each of these colleagues to speak. We're going to start at the center in Ukraine. We're going to talk a little bit about the history and the context of what's happening. We're going to move out to Germany and to Europe, and then we're going to come to the United States and talk about the questions of American role in all of this. Well, first I'd like to ask Edith, Clowes, and Kyrill Kunakhovich to speak first, and they're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine's history, its place in Europe, and why this issue of, is Ukraine, what is the relationship between Ukraine and Russia historically, linguistically, culturally, so we can better understand the various claims that are being made right now that are buttressing this conflict. So Edith, I'm going to ask you to begin, but let me get the map up, and then you can use that mic to get us started.
Can you hear me? All right.
I'm not hearing anything.
Good. And can everybody in the Zoom room? I suppose I could start talking while you're getting.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, that looks good. Thank you. It is truly heartening to see everybody here today and know that there are twice as many of you if we count the Zoom crowd. Thank you so much for coming out today, and let's use this, as Will said, as a way to really energize ourselves for further action. So I'm a professor in the Slavic department, and I'm here to tell you that Putin is wrong on pretty much every way, but particularly his claim that Ukraine isn't really a country. And I'm going to now use my 5-6 minutes to give you the quick and dirty about what makes Ukraine its own country, right? Let's start with geography. Geography is the basis of pretty much everything. Ukraine is in a very flat region of the earth that I call, imagine, for example, Kansas in the Great Plains, but being surrounded by lots of hostile groups. It's the steppe. It's not the plain in Russian or in Ukraine, in Ukrainian. It's called steppe. And think of it, it stretches for thousands of miles from east to west and west to east. It's the steppe superhighway, which is basically a place where lots of tribes from time immemorial, prehistory, have roamed. But in the modern and pre-modern era, it's also the geopolitical edge of empires. The meaning of the name Ukraine is, people argue about it, but at the heart of the name Ukraina is the word krai, which means edge. or part or region. And it's usually taken to mean the area at the edge or periphery of something. Okay. Also, ironically, this is a very fraught region because it has probably the richest soil of any place in the world. It's extremely rich and has been thought in over the ages as being the breadbasket of Europe. But I want to mention just a few of the empires that have treated this territory that's now Ukraine as an edge or a periphery. So we'll start with, actually to start with, in the beginning of its sort of written culture, it was the center of East European sort of power, Kievan Rus, R-U-S. And that was ruled, though, by Norse Varangians, not Slavs, right? Then we have the Mongols who squashed Kiev. Then we have the Poles, the Muscovites, the Ottoman Turks, and the Tsarist Russian Empire. And my colleague Kyrill is going to talk about Soviet and post-Soviet power structures and Ukraine. Russian and Ukrainian share quite a lot in terms of language roots and certain cultural roots as well. They were all, to begin with, in the sort of mists of time, East Slavs, and they all have fairly similar languages. And nowadays, these East Slavs are divided into 3 countries, basically: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. What I want to do now is just use a couple minutes to talk about the big historical events that split these East Slavs into these 3 parts. Okay, what made Ukrainian a language and culture distinct from Russian? It's built from a variety of sources, other Slavic groups, Latin, and so forth, that Russian doesn't really share. So we talk about, say, the mid 10th century to the mid 13th century, we have Kievan Rus. And at that time, what will become Russian and what will become Ukrainian are separate dialects, but basically of the same language. Then the Mongols crush Kievan Rus. Kiev, the city, is leveled, and we hope that that doesn't happen again. And we have the disappearance of writing culture from that region of the East Slavic area, East Europe. 15th and 16th century, then Kiev becomes part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We have the influx of West Slavic, Polish, and then also Latinate words into this particular language. Under Polish influence, but still retaining its, what I haven't said, Orthodox Christian nature. In Kiev, the Mohyla seminary becomes a portal for European Renaissance and then Reformation learning, which eventually will seep over into Russia. Kiev is a more cultivated place at this point than, say, Moscow is, certainly in its own way. Okay, most of Ukrainian territory, though, along the Black Sea and so forth, is known as a wild border zone. It's a place where runaway serfs and others, runaway nobles as well, who were wanted by the law, founded their own communities and became known as eventually as the very militaristic Cossacks. So Ukrainians have a certain pride in a kind of Cossack heritage. Okay, but that's also shared elsewhere as well. Okay, then we move to the 18th century when Catherine the Great, Catherine II, subjected and divided Poland. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was long gone. She brings in Germans, Jews, and various other communities to settle this land, partly so that, they're beholden to her, and they have a buffer zone from the Turks and Europe. Okay, Russia, Ukrainian territory now becomes known as Little Russia, which is a bit demeaning. Then the western edge of Ukraine, as you can see here, Lviv, if you can find the city, becomes part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Kiev, Kharkiv now will become part of the Russian Empire. Okay, quick now, the real sort of modern Ukrainian national consciousness comes through that, what I always call the canary in the coal mine literature, right? Poetry, plays, epics, novels, and so forth. By the late 18th century, so Catherine's time, already there's pushback in the literary world. A man named Ivan Kotlяревский celebrates Cossacks in a lively, if somewhat bawdy epic, right? And it's, so the characters are there. He's writing in Ukrainian, partly in Ukrainian at least. 19th century, the very famous founder of sort of modern Ukrainian language, Taras Shevchenko, celebrates Ukrainian lyric poetry. 19th and early 20th century, the activist Lesia Ukrainka, and that's her pseudonym, pushes actively for Ukrainian nationhood, but through theater, through dramas. Theater is so important because you can script, you can imagine yourself acting in a certain way. It's not by chance that the current president is a stand-up comedian, right? Theater helps you imagine how you can play out your life. Mid to late 20th, 21st century now, Lena Kostenka is the most important living Ukrainian poet. I think my time is well up. I have a poem. If there's time later, maybe I'll read it. Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope you can hear me. I will stand up here so that I can show you a few pictures.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Kyrill Kunakhovich. I teach in the history department. My goal today is very briefly to tell you about the history of Ukraine and Russia in the 20th century, and also about the role that that past still continues to play in the present. So, as Edith said, at the turn of the century, Ukraine is a major thriving part of the Russian Empire. It is known as the breadbasket of Europe. It is extraordinarily productive. It is multi-ethnic, multilingual, very diverse, very vibrant. And there is also, as Edith mentioned, a growing Lithuanian or Ukrainian nationalist movement that the Russian czars take great pains to suppress, because for them, this region is Little Russia. It is not a breakaway. It is not to be a model for the falling apart of the empire. And so there is this attempt to suppress Ukrainian, to argue that it is a dialect and not its own language. There is a systematic persecution. And then the empire does fall apart. World War I comes and sweeps it off the map of Europe. This whole region becomes an arena of civil war and also of growing communist influence, both in Russia, in Moscow, Leningrad, and in Kiev. There is an emerging communist state that comes into being. In 1922, it becomes the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Ukraine becomes one of those republics.
I got you. Don't worry.
All right, thank you. I will show you a picture in a second. Ukraine becomes one of those republics. It is one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. And yet, as you can see, it is, of course, a very small part of the USSR as a whole. It's a very unequal relationship. It's in that top left corner. And it is, of course, on the edge of the USSR. As Edith mentioned, it has long been the edge of empires. It is also at the heart of the Soviet project, partly because it is so productive, partly because it is so diverse. And the Soviet Union wants to classify it, tame it, civilize it, mold it in its own image. That involves doing something different from the czars. Unlike the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union promotes Ukrainian, promotes local culture, local identity, local elites. It wants to show to the world that it is not an empire, but it is an anti-imperial state in which different peoples can thrive. So the 1920s, even 1930s, are an era of cultural flowering, but they are also an era of communist state building, of political controls in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Republics are meant to have greater cultural autonomy, but are meant to toe a very close political line. And that involves purges, that involves famines. Ukraine is at the heart of a major Soviet effort to collectivize agriculture, which means basically starving millions of people in an effort to force them to join collective farms. At least 4 million people die in Ukraine in the 1930s. And it is also central to the USSR's global ambition. Because Ukraine is at the edge of the Soviet Union, Soviet leaders are always afraid of what they call capitalist encirclement. They feel that the world is out to get them. That is the driving force behind the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which is a secret treaty signed in 1939. Basically, Hitler and Stalin split up Poland between them. A chunk of what was Poland, that's number 3 on this map, gets tacked on to Ukraine. And after the war, those borders are sanctioned. They become permanent with Western approval at the Yalta Conference held in current Ukraine. Here is what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill says when emigre leaders protest, when they say, how come you're just giving over all these people to Soviet power? They say, you, the emigres, are callous people who want to wreck Europe. You do not care about the future of Europe. You have only your own miserable interests in mind. I feel as if I were in a lunatic asylum. There's a long history, right? Not just of Soviet Russian leaders, also of Western leaders, of treating this region as sort of disposable geopolitical toy and its inhabitants as an afterthought to the interests of Europe. After the war, this land, as I suggested, is annexed to the Soviet Union. A large chunk of what was Poland becomes part of the Ukrainian SSR. This is a broader buffer zone. And there is also an effort to denazify this territory. When Putin talks about denazifying Ukraine, what he's referring to is a post-war moment when the language of denazification was used to justify Soviet occupation. He's also referring to a broader Soviet ideology that saw the West as fundamentally fascist or Nazi, right? We tend to equate communism and fascism. For us, those are totalitarian ideologies. From the Soviet perspective, it was the other way around. Fascism and capitalism were one and the same. This argument of denazifying Ukraine, it is about Ukraine, it's also about us, right? That is a way of for Putin to say Ukraine is just a stepping stone towards this kind of broader threat, the real enemy, what he calls the American empire of lies. In 1991, the Soviet Union, which came into being after World War II, falls apart. Russia and Ukraine both become independent states for the first time, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia. And they have to confront a lot of common challenges. Challenges of dealing with a crippled economy, challenges of dealing with political instability, the rise of oligarchs, of political disinformation. They also deal with a challenge of national identity. Who are we if we are not part of an empire, if we are not part of a Soviet Union? And it is a communal challenge in both of them. But in Russia, we have seen that challenge take the form of greater aggression towards Ukraine over the past 2 decades under Vladimir Putin in particular. In 2014, as you know, Putin annexed that peninsula off the Black Sea, Crimea, fomented a nationalist breakaway uprising in the eastern regions, and it was very popular. Polling that we have, right, shows that this attempt to take over chunks of Ukraine by Russia has been seen by many Russians as a way of state building, nation building, of elevating the country to new heights. And yet we've also seen another nation being born in the same process. And that, sorry, so many slides. This is the last one. And that is something that we've seen in Ukraine, right? Ukraine has been divided politically, culturally, since 1991. It has struggled in many ways to develop a communal identity. And yet, Russian occupations, Russian attacks have really changed the picture. So in 2013, on the eve of this takeover of Crimea, you can see, right, almost equal support for looking west to the European Union and looking east to Russia's Eurasian Union. That changed radically in 2014. It's a completely different picture now. And one thing we've really seen so far in this invasion, right, is that it has brought together a Ukrainian nation, a Ukrainian identity in a way that we have not seen. Certainly not since 91 and possibly ever. But the story so far of this invasion has not just been Russian might, it has been the story of the Ukrainian people standing up to that power. I think the long history that we've tried to sketch out helps explain where it all came about.
Thank you, Kyrill. Well, moving just widening the aperture just a little bit, Manuela wants to give some remarks about Germany and Europe and the way that it has changed in response to what's happened. It's been quite remarkable. Would you like to introduce yourself and take it away?
Yeah, hi, I'm Manuela Achilles. I teach in the German department and in the history department, and I direct the European Studies program. Can you hear me? Okay, so what I want to talk about is a little bit about Europe's history of violence. And then in particular about Germany, which has been a particularly violent actor for a long time. So when we talk about Europe's history of violence, the years, you know, the end of the 19th century to 1945 are often described as an era of violence, right? Then followed by a decisive shift in Europe toward diplomacy and trade integration. While violent conflicts still erupted in Europe, such in Bosnia and Kosovo, the region did not see violence as a main characteristic of the present age. That's what I think that's what I would argue. The German case is particularly interesting in the European context and in the context of a history of violence, because it explains past approaches as well as the current paradigm change, which has been described in Germany as a Zeitenwende, a kind of a beginning of a new era, a change in the time, something that's really fundamentally changes just about everything. So that's kind of the German term is Zeitenwende. So that's what Germans kind of are thinking is happening right now,
Manuel,
because what's
pull the mic right up.
happening in Ukraine. So as we know, Germany was the aggressor in 2 world wars in the 20th century and the perpetrator of the Holocaust and other crimes. Much of this violence devastated large parts of Russia and the Ukraine. After the Second World War, the country was divided. Eastern Germany became a communist state and part of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Western Germany adopted liberal democracy together with a social market economy and integrated into the European Union and NATO. During the Cold War, the 2 Germanys were separated by an internal border, most powerfully symbolized by the Berlin Wall. In this period, Western dialogue with Russia seemed to have positive effects. In the 1970s, relations thawed and more contact was permitted between the 2 Germanys. Extensive negotiations with the USSR enabled the unification of East and West Germany in 1990. The United Germany, perceiving itself as a mid-sized country, not a world power now, as a mid-sized country and a mediator, tried to keep the dialogue with Russia open and left sharper military tasks to other countries. Against strong objections from a variety of stakeholders and partners, the country also developed an unusual large dependency on Russian natural gas, coal, and also oil. So about half of Germany's natural gas imports are from Russia. The same could be said for coal, and I think 1/3 of its oil comes from Russia as well. Not least because of these dependency, but certainly also because of its opposition to military solutions to political conflicts, Germany was one of the last holdouts in favor of a diplomatic approach to the crisis in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed all of that. Last Sunday, in a special session of the German parliament, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced an immediate massive boost to its defense spending, to the country's defense spending, 100 billion euro in a fund that's supposed to be anchored in the constitution so that it is available on a more continuous basis. As well as they also agreed on delivery of defensive weapons to Ukraine. Germany has never agreed to directly deliver weapons into a crisis situation. It also reversed its stance on Russia's exclusions from the Swiss payment network. And in addition, the German government announced significant spending to reduce its reliance on Russian energy. Germany's new resolve extends to the European Union. The German Chancellor, in his address to the special session, said it quite aptly when he proclaimed, "Rarely have we and our partners been so resolved and so united." This is a complete turnaround, complete shift in anything Germany has done since it was defeated in 1945. Public opinion has also shifted. Polls show that about 80% of Germans support the arms exports and investment into the armed forces. In Germany and Europe, the war feels close to home, and you will hear in Europe people saying, "We are at war, Europe is at war, and people are afraid." And if you think about all these kind of different steps in your European history, right, and in kind of also in Germany during the Cold War, right? I mean, a kind of an evocation of an activation of kind of nuclear weapons in any way recalls a lot of anxieties in Germany. So many layers of history there. There's real fear there. As for possible splits or kind of frictions, people are in Europe, I think, are looking at the refugee situation. There are 5 million people, 500,000 people on the move right now, and there will be more. I kind of want to say here something that sounds maybe a little bit cynical, because we know about the refugee situation, migration, and how it has been so controversial in Europe. The refugees from Ukraine tend to not to be seen as non-European. They tend to be seen as European, East European people, and they are being seen as a people that fights for European values such as freedom and democracy. And as such, they have right now a lot of support. So I don't think that in the immediate future, this will be a reason for any friction in the European Union. So that's all I want to say.
Right. And thank you, Edith, for coming, by the way. I know you have to go. Thank you, Manuela. All right, so, yeah. I'm going to jump in and give you my 2 cents, because post-war Europe is something that I've studied a bit, and I want to just give you, ask a question. I want to ask a question and see if I have a short answer. What caused this change? In 1 week, not just German foreign policy, but pretty much European foreign policy, and for that matter, even maybe American foreign policy, has gone through a dramatic change. And I want to give you what I think are 4 reasons why Europe has changed so much and so quickly. The European Union is not an institution known for moving fast or for unanimity, but it has moved with incredible speed and remarkable unanimity in acting, both to impose economic sanctions and to begin the process of aiding Ukrainian forces. Why did that happen? What motivated them? In my view, the answers include the following. Race. Let's go there. There is an element of European action that is, we can understand, we can frame around the idea that Russian atrocities in Chechnya and Syria did not rise to the level of outrages in the Western European capitals because they were not perceived to be part of a European kinship network. Now, you can say I'm wrong, you can say that's ridiculous, but that's just my take. I think it's a factor. I don't think it's the only factor, but I do think it's a factor, and I think it's something that we ought as well to shine a light on. Who's in Europe and who's out of it? This is an argument Europeans have been having for generations. Who's a member of Europe and who isn't? Ukrainians have been immediately styled as part of the European family this week, and good. But I can assure you, it's not just because they're being bombed that there is this action. It's also because of who they are, their culture, their religion, etc. Second, fear. Europeans are fearful. Poland is a member of NATO, a member of the European Union, is on the front lines. And from there, it's not too far to Germany. And from there, it's not too far to the rest of Western Europe. This is a crisis that immediately jeopardizes European security. And Europeans are frightened about where this could go. So fear is number two. Third, I do think there is an element of shame involved. And there should be. Because for 2 decades, Europeans have been happily guzzling down Russian gas and oil, and they have been happily taking Russian oligarchs' money and putting them into their banks, and they've been happily serving as places where Russian wealth can be spent in the Rivieras of Europe and in the great cities of Europe. We've also participated in this, so let's not suggest there's anything particularly virtuous about America here, but I do think there is a sense of shame about this right now, as there should be. That is also a factor. That sense of shame probably should have been triggered a long time ago, but nonetheless, I think that's an element in the scale. And finally, and this will transition to our Americanists, I do believe, as someone who studied post-1945 Europe, I do believe the role of the President of the United States in the last year has been crucial in mobilizing Europeans. Now, this is not a partisan comment, but it is a political one. Joe Biden has a very different attitude towards European alliance, the European alliance and its relationship with the United States than his predecessor did. And that's perfectly all right. They're allowed to have differences about the value of NATO, the meaning of the European Union, the meaning of a transatlantic security alliance. And they have starkly different views. Biden's presidency, overlapping with this crisis, has been absolutely crucial in reassuring the Europeans that America would stand with them and would help to implement many of these economic sanctions, which only the United States was really able to guarantee. So the role of the US in encouraging a unified European action has been absolutely crucial. Who is president matters enormously in times of crisis. And I think we've seen that this week. Well, that's a good segue. I want to turn it over to those of our colleagues up here who can really talk about American security strategy and diplomacy, and also the dangers of the United States being drawn into some kind of conflict as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. Todd, let's just get the big, the big question out here right at the beginning. Look, Todd Sechser of the politics department is an expert on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and he wants to say a little bit about the fact that these are nuclear powers we're dealing with, and how might that play into the situation. Go ahead.
Yeah, great, thank you. I teach a class called International Security in the Nuclear Age. So I'll talk a little bit about the nuclear dimension of this crisis and the war. And I want to come at it from a standpoint of what do we know right now? The situation, of course, this crisis is very fluid. Things are changing, numbers are flying all over the internet and Twitter and social media. And what we say now, what we think we know could change within minutes or hours. So I just want to sort of start with what do we know? And I want to talk about 3 things. One is, how do you make a nuclear threat? And why do we think the Russians have potentially made one, particularly this weekend when it appears that Vladimir Putin announced an alert of Russian nuclear forces? Secondly, what is a nuclear alert? And what did Russia actually do? And then thirdly, what do we know about how Russia might use nuclear weapons or might be planning in broad strokes to use nuclear weapons in a conflict potentially like this one? Okay, so first question, how do you make a nuclear threat? How do leaders do this? I think there are really four main ways that a country can make a nuclear threat. One is simply implicitly by having nuclear weapons in their possession, relying on the fact that an adversary can never really ignore them, and you can never really fully discount the possibility that they could be used in a conflict. So just lurking there in the background, nuclear weapons exist. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, about 4,500 nuclear warheads compared to 3,600 in the United States. That is, of course, down significantly from the Soviet peak in the Cold War, which is about 45,000 nuclear weapons, but still more than the United States and the largest of any nuclear power. So implicitly is one way to do it. Secondly, maybe a step up from that is to make a verbal threat, to verbally invoke the possibility of using nuclear weapons. Leaders very rarely do this by actually speaking about nuclear weapons. They usually use some kind of oblique language, severe consequences. Putin, a few days ago at the outset of the war, talked about consequences you have never encountered in your history when he was warning other countries against intervening in the conflict. One of the things that made, one of the many things that made Donald Trump unique was that Donald Trump was more willing to talk in explicit terms about the use of nuclear weapons than really any American president ever. When he would say things like on Twitter, threatening North Korea's leader, I have a much bigger nuclear button and mine actually works. He's actually talking about nuclear weapons as opposed to referring them to them indirectly. But generally, they're discussed in indirect terms. So a verbal threat is number two. Number three is to conduct some kind of test of nuclear capabilities. Famously, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States conducted an actual test of a nuclear weapon, perceived or potentially perceived as very escalatory, very aggressive. Now, it turned out that this test was not in any way coordinated with the Kennedy administration. It was just a pre-planned, pre-scheduled test that happened to occur during one of the tensest moments of the Cold War. But testing these capabilities, right, the context matters. If you do it, especially during a crisis, it can be perceived as a threat. Just prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia conducted a test, just a week prior, actually, a test of 3 hypersonic missiles, missiles that can travel multiple times the speed of sound and could potentially carry nuclear weapons. So tested 3 of these missiles, and you know, now we can interpret that as at least an oblique nuclear threat. And then perhaps most aggressively, or most threateningly, a country can move its nuclear forces in some way, conduct some kind of movement of its nuclear capabilities, increasing its alert status, moving around nuclear assets. And this is what it seems like Vladimir Putin did on Sunday when he announced an increase in the alert level of Russian nuclear forces. So that brings us to question number 2. What is a nuclear alert? What does that mean? And then what did the Russians do that makes us think that they might have alerted their nuclear forces? In general terms, a nuclear alert refers to an increase in the readiness of nuclear forces. So preparing in some way, or taking the first steps in preparing to potentially use them in a conflict. Why is this important? Well, there are 3 basic kinds of, or 3 basic varieties of nuclear weapons that we can distinguish among, and that's based on the way in which they are delivered to their target. So we generally distinguish between nuclear weapons that are launched from land, so like a missile silo, for example, or the back of a truck, a mobile launcher. Number two, missiles that are launched from the sea, generally nuclear submarines. And then thirdly, nuclear weapons that are launched or delivered from the air, so bombers that launch cruise missiles or drop gravity bombs. And each of these three types of nuclear weapons, Russia has all three, the United States has all three. When we refer to the nuclear triad, this is what we're talking about: land-based, sea-based, and air-delivered nuclear weapons. And each of the three requires a variety of preparations that you need to take in order to use them. So for example, if you want to use your nuclear weapons, you need to put the warheads on the delivery device, put the warheads, nuclear warhead on the bomb, or attach it to the ballistic missile. You might need to fuel up your ballistic missiles, particularly if you are using liquid-fueled intercontinental missiles. The fuel is very corrosive and you can't just let it sit in the missile indefinitely. You have to fuel it up right before it's going to be launched. If you are using nuclear armed submarines, you need to send them out to sea where they can't be destroyed. If you are using mobile launchers, so these giant trucks you see videos of that launch nuclear missiles, it's generally a good idea to send them out into the field, into the forests or mountainous areas where they're very difficult to locate and destroy. Any of these actions could be perceived as provocative. Any of them could be potentially part of a nuclear alert. And they're potentially provocative because a country that undertakes these actions could be seen as preparing to use nuclear weapons. So that's why we're constantly watching what countries are doing with their nuclear forces to see if they're taking any of these actions to prepare to use nuclear weapons. These things have been done before. Nuclear alerts have been undertaken before. The last time that I'm aware of is 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, when the United States increased the alert status of its nuclear forces. And the question is, what did Russia do over the weekend? As far as we know, Vladimir Putin announced an increase in the alert level of Russian nuclear forces. But what's interesting about this supposed nuclear alert is that it did not, as far as we know at least, entail any of these actions that would be seen as increasing the readiness level of Russian nuclear assets. Bringing warheads to their delivery vehicles, putting bombers in the air, sending submarines out to sea, and so forth. Again, there are limits to what we know in the public domain, but all of that information suggests that Russia did not accompany Putin's statement with any of these actions. So let me say one last thing. What do we know about how Russia might use nuclear weapons? The answer is not very much. There is a debate in the nuclear security community about what Russian plans might be. One view sort of takes its evidence from Russian official statements, and those statements say that Russia will use nuclear weapons only if Russia is attacked by nuclear weapons, or if the security of Russia's nuclear arsenal or the state itself are in jeopardy. Another view says that Russia has been planning for the last 20 years to use nuclear weapons at a lower level in the event that Russia's losing a conventional war. But at the very least, sort of if you take nothing else away from my remarks, should we all be building bomb shelters as a result of what Putin said on Sunday? My answer would be, at the very least, not yet. There is no convincing evidence that Russia is any more prepared today than it was on Saturday to use nuclear weapons in this conflict. Now, of course, things could change, and we have to stay alert to that. But at least on the ground, as far as we can tell, we're not on the precipice of a nuclear war. I'll stop.
Woo! Are you reassured? I don't know. Thank you, Todd. That was great. So, talk a little bit about American security options and the sort of big picture of defense and how the United States is probably thinking about this crisis at the moment.
Yeah,
And then
so
Philip, you can
I'll
wrap
try
up.
to be quick here. I recognize.
Yeah, go right into the mic though.
Right, all right,
You can take that out of the thing if
Are
you
these
want to.
working all right?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll try to be relatively quick here because I realize we've been here a while. Folks probably have questions and we want to get to those as well. So let me just give you some broad brushstrokes that maybe you can give some thought to and form into questions. So I direct the National Security Policy Center at the Batten School, and we do a lot of work with folks directly in the IC and the Department of Defense. And I would say just, again, sort of top of the waves on this, there's two things that really surprised folks about what we saw, right? One of those was how poorly Putin's plan worked, okay? It's easy to say that that was all very clear now, but I think that was not the way it was predicted at the outset. The second of these, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit more about, is how well our plan worked, all right? What the US was doing in this domain in terms of policy toward Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. And what I mean by that is that we had sort of a short-term and a long-term thing going here, all right? After 2014, Crimea, it was pretty clear that, in the words of one special forces guy I was talking to yesterday, that the Ukrainian forces were garbage, right? We did a lot of training, right? We have a lot of folks who have gone through that part of the world on training exercises and things along those lines, making sure those the military was, increased in its capacity. We moved a lot of countries moved a lot of weaponry into Ukraine, which we've talked about already. The big difference is that that worked, right? And I think it was a little bit surprising to folks the extent to which the result of that was substantial capability and backbone in that force. It also seemingly caught Vladimir Putin by surprise, right? So that was sort of the longer term notion. And I'll also add part of the reason why some of the things that went on politically with Ukraine during the Trump administration caused sort of behind the scenes consternation in security circles, because it went along the lines of like, hey, there's a longer term plan here that we're working on. There's a capacity issue that we're working on here. And this is getting messed around with, right? It's getting pulled into the light in ways that we're uncomfortable with in terms of the consequences, all right? In the short term, as this crisis emerged, there was another plan, which I think bears scrutiny here, right? And that was taking an actor like Putin, who prefers to operate in bad information environments, in gray areas, with ambiguity, with false information, and just dragging it into the light, right? So again, it caused some consternation in IC circles, intelligence community circles, but the Biden administration went with this policy of, it was like they had an open diary, right? Dear diary, I think today we're seeing Putin do X, Y, and Z. It was this radical transparency policy, right? And what that did is it created an incredibly uncomfortable operating environment for Putin, right? Because we decided that we were going to put our credibility up against Russian credibility, and that's one where we do a little bit better, all right? The second part of that, which I think is incredibly important from a European standpoint, is our allies really value transparency on our part. One of the chief complaints they get is that, hey, you're not reading us in on the things that matter, right? That transparency is a lot of the reason why we see this very, very rapid move to unanimity, which is so surprising within Europe. So again, an outcropping of this plan that I think is interesting and important. Now, the problem with your plan working too well, or maybe not too well, but better than you were thinking, in conjunction with the adversary's plan not working as well as they were hoping, is that you very quickly sort of catch the car, right? And that's the situation that we're in now that I think we really need to step back and think about, okay? And what I mean by that is that we have gone into a place where I hear a certain amount of sort of jubilation about performance, right? You know, isn't it amazing the Ukrainians are doing as well as they are? Isn't it as amazing that the Russians are in as much disarray as they are? Both of those things are true, but they also mean that this is about to get a whole lot worse, which is, I think, something that folks are already beginning to recognize. But the capacity issues are such that Russia's going to be able to swamp the situation, All right, these cities are in trouble, and we all kind of know that on one level. But as you sort of look at the implications of what has already occurred, that leaves open some avenues for escalation that I think are really, really dangerous. Okay, so one of these, as we were already talking about, Europe has already decided that they are essentially going to have open borders on between Ukraine and Poland, and I think it'll be other countries before all is said and done, right? At the same time, they're shipping deadly aid into Ukraine, all right? It's very, very easy to imagine a world where as these cities fall, as the Ukrainian army gets pushed back, they end up pinned up against Western Europe, right? And operating across that border. And then you have NATO countries aiding an insurgency or a military force across a border. Russians decide they need to do something about that. Super volatile situation. Okay, and so that's something that I think, you know, as your plan succeeds, you got to jump forward and make the next plan. And that's something I think you want to plan around. The second thing I'll give you just to think about, just by way of example, there are a lot of things that are emerging in this conflict that are new to us, all right? And are in areas that we have not developed a lot of doctrine around, a lot of policy around. So take, for example, Elon Musk recently announced that he was going to boot up Starlink for Ukraine, right? So that they wouldn't be able to cut off internet access. Information would be able to get out there, all right? Very easy to imagine a world where, and this is already happening, but Russia is able to cut off normal Ukrainian communication channels, right? Starlink effectively becomes Ukrainian command and control. What do, right? If you're the Russians, do you start taking those satellites down, right? And if you do, what does the US do in response to a foreign actor acting aggressively toward private industry assets? We don't have answers to those questions, all right? And so again, kind of looking forward, we need to develop them. And that's sort of where I think we are in this conflict. It's moving incredibly, incredibly fast.
Okay, now I'm scared again. Well, there's one of the panelists, our final panelist, who spent a great many years working in the US government at the highest levels and at times of extraordinary transformation and crisis, Philip Zelikow. And I want to give him a chance to wrap things up. Tell us a little bit, pull the curtain back a little bit, Philip, and give us a sense for what might be going on inside the circles of government, how they're handling the crisis, what kinds of, what's it like to be in this moment for your colleagues who are trying to keep us out of World War III. Go ahead.
The last time I met Vladimir Putin was in June 2006. It was an evening meeting at the Kremlin. I was there accompanying the Secretary of State, to whom I was a kind of deputy, Condi Rice. Putin is a calm, deliberate person. He's not the kind of person who does temper tantrums and speaks impulsively. It's worth noting, just to give you a sense of color, when you visit the Kremlin, I'd been working on European security issues in and out of government for the previous 20 years. I had been to Russia a number of times and been to the Kremlin before. The Kremlin in 2006 was a beautiful place. The interiors, by the way, had nothing to do with the look of the interiors that you would have found in Soviet days. Tsar Alexander III in 1881 would have walked into these halls and said, "You've done a wonderful job with the place." The look is totally Tsarist and beautiful. You can see some interiors. The Kremlin guards now, and in 2006, were completely outfitted in 19th century uniforms wearing shakos. Okay, ceremonial dress uniforms of the Tsarist age. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of the color. So we go in, we have this meeting. There are various things going on in the world. Putin spends 15 minutes of this meeting complaining about the days in the 17th century when Moscow was being brutalized by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and what a threat the Lithuanians really were. So Condi Rice and I come out of this meeting. And, we leave the Kremlin, walk off, and we kind of look at each other. We've known each other a long time. Look at each other like, what was that about? So just two morals of that story. The first moral is, I really do think when people study the history of all this, the period of the late 2000s is really important. I think the period, I think the last 15 years especially is a period in which there's a real turn in some really distinctive ways. The war in Ukraine has actually been going on without a stop for 8 years. And many thousands have already been dying, and they've been dying week in and week out for 8 years. But a lot of the seeds start getting planted really at this very period, and especially heating up in 2007 and 2008. But the second point, other than this sort of historical observation, is that don't think of Putin as just a typical Russian nationalist. There's a distinctive personality here with a distinctive individual sense of national destiny, and that's important. The only other little anecdote I'll offer is one that I didn't personally experience except to see it on television, and many of you may have done so too. It happened only 3.5 weeks ago. So the Olympics are getting started in Beijing. Vladimir Putin flies to Beijing in person for a meeting with Xi Jinping. This is their 38th meeting. It's by far the most intense summit level relationship Xi Jinping has with any other leader in the world. They've spoken more than 100 times. The two men want to get together in person to reveal and unfold a joint statement of China and Russia. This is February 4th. You can read it. It's 5,300 words long. And it's available in English translation. If you read it, your experience may be an odd one. You'll read this and think, this looks like it was written by the Model UN at my high school. Because as soon as you get into it, we are so in favor of democracy in the world. And the first page of the statement is full of statements praising democracy, praising we need an open world order that in which people are equal, inclusive, uphold international law. I mean, you're like, whoa. Again, the statement reads in this way, so what could possibly be wrong with this? I mean, you can read some fine print. Basically, they're complaining there are people who represent a minority of the world that are trying to divide people, unlike us who believe in an open, democratic world governed by international law. That's February 4th. As that statement was being announced, the tanks and missile launchers to invade Ukraine were already moving into their go positions. As that statement was being launched, more than 100,000 troops had already been mobilized in plans that had actually been prepared for months. As that joint statement was being announced, the Chinese government was in possession of intelligence that had been passed to it by the United States government that detailed the Russian plans for this invasion in the hope that Xi Jinping would ask Putin not to do it. And Xi Jinping's response to that intelligence and that request was to pass the US intelligence on to Putin. That was February 4th. And I tell these two anecdotes partly to a little bit of a sense of historical roots and color that perhaps adds a little detail to the excellent presentations you heard starting with Edith Clowes. But the second anecdote is designed to tell you that there is a pretense of world order under which we've been functioning for a while. And what we're now seeing, though, is underneath the pretense, there is a reality of world order, and that all of you are now entering a world of choices again, a world of a serious world, a world in which people are doing serious things. And your generation, in a way, is going to have to build the new world order that is going to take the place of the world order that's now coming to, an end. I was part of building that at the beginning of the 1990s, working in the White House for Bush 41, the elder President Bush. I was then a career diplomat, not a political appointee. And I was involved in the negotiations to unify Germany and create an arms control treaty that destroyed and reduced more arms than any arms control treaty ever enacted in the history of the human race. Completely successful. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains, a treaty that was torn up by Vladimir Putin the year after that meeting in the Kremlin in 2007. About 4.5 years ago, I had an essay in the Atlantic magazine that was entitled, "Is the World Slouching Toward a Grave Systemic Crisis?" Question mark. Slouching, of course, alluding to the Yeats poem. Is the world slouching toward a grave systemic crisis? That was published in 2017. That question's now been answered. It's now been answered. The world order that was created to build a global commonwealth that had a lot of success over the last 32 years, that is now coming to an end. And you and your colleagues are going to decide now what is going to take its place.
So why don't you hang on to that? It's 6:10. We're going to give y'all about 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to come around with a mic. Here's the rules. You have to use the mic and you can't make a speech. You have to have a question. Ian and I are going to do this. Raise your hand if you have a question to any one of our panelists. And please, be courteous to the panelists and to your peers. They don't want to listen to you ranting. They just want to hear your good question. So oh, great. Thanks, Todd. Maybe I will take that actually, and you can. All right, who do I see? All right. This is, yeah, you're right. You're good to go.
Thank you very much.
Speak loudly into the.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I've received a letter circulating at the university, originated, I think, by graduate students in Slavic and their allies. It is a very emotional letter, and everybody wants to relate to it at many levels. But one of the demands, one of the requests that made me pause, it concerns no-fly zone, demanding no-fly zone over Ukraine, which makes sense emotionally, but I think touches on the dangers of escalations that you were talking. So I wonder, I don't know if any discussions took place, but I wonder what you would respond in this respect. And to continue this, what would be a meaningful letter? We feel at the university that we need to create some collective response. Administration has been silent so far. So what can we do? What would be reasonable ways to support Ukraine, to support effort at building or trying to think about alternative, better order? So what can we do?
Phil, you want to take the no-fly zone? That's been much talked about in the media and press.
Absolutely. So, one of the great things about a fractious, vibrant democracy,
Mike,
you have all sorts of voices who can say all sorts of things. The downside to a vibrant, fractious democracy is some of those things might be deeply unreasonable. There is no serious conversation about putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine, right? Doing that, if you think through the actions involved in that, that is immediately moving into World War III territory, right? And from a practical standpoint, just in terms of how that would actually be accomplished, it's also not immediately possible, right? So what I would say is that, we always need to be very careful about what we say, particularly, and folks should be, but you can't take the tweet of every member of Congress entirely seriously in that instance. I know, Will is going to walk out of the room now. So that would be what I would say on that front, and in a way that is already receded, I think, into the background in terms of something that folks are talking about quite thankfully.
Manuela or Kyrill, do you want to address the question of, are there public statements? What should we do? Is there something that you probably are wondering, like, what the hell should we do? What can we do? What is an appropriate gesture? I don't know if you have any ideas. Maybe you want to think about it a moment. But I'm not entirely sure. I think actually doing what we're doing here is a pretty good thing. You saw the list of charities that you can give to, but I think your question is really about, should we have a common statement? I'm not quite sure we know what to say yet. So maybe that's the issue. All right, hands. Ian, do you want to go up that way? Just find some person who looks reasonably sane. You made the cut.
Thanks. One of the big criticisms following the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan was the inadvertent enabling of weapons proliferation by leaving U.S. material in the hands of the Afghan military, which, as we now know, quickly fell into the hands of the Taliban. What are some measures that countries who are providing military aid to Ukraine can implement to prevent weapons proliferation and creating greater long-term stability throughout the region?
That's a pretty interesting question.
I'm happy to take it, but I don't want to dominate.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
But make sure you're using the mic.
I mean, at this stage, not much, right? Especially the types of things that are being put into Ukraine. So, you know, there's been talk about the sharing of some MiG jets with Poland. Those things are pretty easy to keep track of, it turns out. Not super easy to operate, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But flooding the place with javelins and stingers, which is a lot of what this is turning out to be, given the types of capabilities that are in play, those are going to float around, right? And we take that risk every time we arm a proxy, right? And so that's not super reassuring, I recognize, but there's just, you can't keep a serial number on there and track it and, you know, ask them to put it to the return depot at the back end. It just doesn't work that way.
It's an interesting question, though, because it does raise the question of the sort of stages of collapse of Ukraine. There is a scenario in which Ukraine becomes a failed state by virtue of just having suffered through this invasion, which is perhaps part of the Russian plan to demonstrate that Ukraine is a collapsed state, has created a power vacuum in this cynical fashion.
And it incentivizes not letting that occur, right? And so going back to that scenario that I was describing, you know, keeping the coherent end of a Ukrainian fighting force in some sort of safe zone somewhere, that's going to be an incredibly tempting thing for European powers in the United States to support, but potentially highly escalatory.
You're so close. I'm just going to take advantage of your being nearby.
So this is sort of for Professor Zelikow. When you were meeting President Putin, you were saying he was a very measured, methodical sort of person. What do you think sparked in him the interest to do this action right now? Like, was there some sort of thing that he saw as a weakness? Was there some sort of chink in the armor of the international community that he could have seen that we haven't seen? Why now? How has he responded to previous US and European administrations? Is that sort of leadership a reason? Is any of this leadership a reason for him deciding right now, I want to do it now?
Well, the honest answer, of course, is I don't know. What I can observe is that this is a long-term project. It really gets going with the crisis. It really gets going with Ukraine in spades in the crisis of 2013-14. Useful to know, by the way, the crisis of 2013-14 was not about NATO. It was all about the EU. Ukraine was trying to do an association agreement with the EU. Russia tried to make them stop. The pro-Russian president was going to go along and make it stop. Ukrainian people overthrew that president, a man named Yanukovych. All over EU issues, it's a fundamental choice. Are you going to join Europe or join Russia? So ever since then, Russia and Ukraine have been at war. And I think there is a culminating conclusion, perhaps after Biden was elected, that my odds of getting my way on this in other ways are going down. You could see what Atlantic solidarity on Ukraine looked like in 2019. when Zelensky was being told, I won't give you any arms unless you give me dirt on Biden. That actually happened. I know it's like 2.5 years ago, but yeah, it wasn't that long ago. It almost seems like it was in another age. So that particular president did not get reelected. So the Russian government has to draw conclusions about, okay, what then are next steps? And I think we can see evidence that they've answered that question.
Who has a history question? Something about Ukraine's identity, languages, the region, Russia, Ukraine. Is this one over here? Okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure you guys are getting your.
I guess this is like kind of like this is pretty history. Do we think like Putin is kind of like the next Hitler? Like, is he gonna stop in Ukraine, or is he gonna go further? Like, do you think it's a lot like World War II, or is it not like that at all?
Come on, Kyrill, take the mic.
Well, this is an easy one, clearly. Well, I will say, right, I don't know if you've seen the protest scenes in Ukraine and in support of Ukraine, but the picture of Putin as Hitler is one that's very popular these days. I guess I'll reiterate something I said, which is I think, this is about Ukraine for Putin. It's also about more than Ukraine. I think he does view this as, well, maybe both a defense from and an attack on a world order. And we alluded to this before. The world order is changing. It will be different now. In other words, I don't think Ukraine is a sufficient goal for him. There are future steps after this. What they are is something we'll have to wait and see.
Yes, so go ahead, Ian. All right, we got a couple more. Don't worry, but we can also talk a little bit afterwards, but go ahead.
I suppose this is a question for anybody who wants to answer, but do you think that Russia, or at least the Russian administration's desire to reintegrate Ukraine into the ethnosphere of Russia is motivating this invasion, or is it something more economical, less, cultural?
Good.
It's a Russian empire play. From an economic point, Russia is not going to do well economically as a result of this move. So that's not. There was no scenario in which this is a real profit bonus for the Russian national coffers. There was a question of how much damage, and so it's. This is a person who wishes to remake world history for a century, for lifetimes not yet lived. It's that level of vision. Okay? They're playing for high stakes.
Well, that's it.
I mean, just to follow on that, I think it is a buffer zone sphere of influence play. I think as during the Soviet era, Ukraine is serving those two roles.
All right, let's see. Have we had a female question? Yes.
I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about the role that Belarus is playing in this and what the government of Belarus is standing to gain from it. And yeah, that's my question.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, another empire play. If you had been following domestic politics in Belarus over the last year, there was actually a major popular effort to change that government, put down with Russian backing. And the current president of Belarus is a Russian puppet. This is now a protectorate and puppet state that has rejoined the empire.
I'd sort of add to that this has flavors of a false coalition, right? Putin was going sort of to various proxy states and saying, hey, come on, you're with me on this. The more amazing part is that some of them actually managed to say no when they almost never say no to anything that he says. But it's not an independent polity.
Yeah.
So I saw a graphic published yesterday by the New York Times that included a map showing nearly 500,000 people fleeing Ukraine westwards towards Poland and other nations, and then an additional 130,000 fleeing towards Russia. What I thought was really interesting was the designation between refugees fleeing towards Europe versus migrants fleeing towards Russia. This is obviously a distinction that's important under international law. So I was wondering if you, as the panel, see a difference between these two groups and what the significance in labeling them as such is.
It is a legally significant distinction. The Russians, they may be eligible for Russian citizenship and may even hold Russian passports for lots of reasons, including family ties. Their citizenship rules are different from ours. If people qualify for refugee status, there are things that go with that under EU rules and under the rules of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So there are important distinctions from an international law perspective.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this from a European perspective, there are serious discussions, and perhaps it's all moving so fast already, decisions to grant refugee status to Ukrainian refugees for 3 years. There's also an effort to organize transportation from Poland to other parts of Europe. For example, German railways grant free travel to any person with a European passport to make sure they can actually come to Germany and travel freely. So there's a lot of at this moment effort in Europe to come to a more organized way of organizing what will become a burden in many different ways, but it's not perceived that it is not perceived as such. But so there's a lot of discussion and very quick decisions. This is very unusual in Europe to have very quick decisions on any of such issues. So that's probably.
Can I just very quickly go back to the first question that was asked, which is what can you do? There's only so much you can do politically. There is a lot you can do to help the millions of people that will flee and that will be refugees and that need urgent material aid, right? I hope we can get some of those links back up. But Ukraine is a country of over 40 million people. About 150,000 have left each day. Only so few because there are so many people that can pass through the exit. There will be millions and millions and millions of refugees who will be stuck without anything for years. They need urgent help. So I think one of our main jobs is to make it possible to provide that humanitarian assistance, which is really at the heart of what the West's response to this can be.
All right, there are a ton of questions still to be asked, and we won't have time for them all. But I'm going to ask you to loudly in the mic ask the penultimate question.
Thank you again to all of you for sharing your insights. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more on the implications for European security. What is European defense and security strategy going to look like in the upcoming years and the upcoming decades? What are we seeing now? And what are we expecting to see in Western Europe, but also looking at the Baltics and just the broader area?
Thank you. Great question.
Well, we're going to see a redivision of Europe and a remilitarization of that division. This has many large implications, of which probably the foremost are some of the ones Phil was talking about a few minutes ago, including there are some immediate implications having to do with simply the management of the potential for escalation in this war. But then there are a series of immediate issues having to do with whether or how to defend the Baltic republics. There's been part of the pretense of world order is the pretense that we can just say someone's in NATO and for sure the Russians will leave them alone because we'll have these battalion multinational battle groups there as tripwires, and the Russians will be scared of that. That's a pretense. Now, I think the notion that the Baltic republics can be this generation's West Berlin can be casually made by people who know very little about the history of the Berlin crisis, which was an incredibly dangerous crisis and was not stable at all in the high crises. So the point is that there are going to be a whole series of issues in which there is a redivision of Europe, a remilitarization of the division, which is going to return a whole set of issues as to what does forward defense require. These were the issues of 1950-51 come back to us now. And what is the relationship of forward defense to possible escalation and credible readiness for a general war with Russia? Now, if that sounds like hard stuff, you bet. It's really hard. And until this crisis, our government has not stepped up in a serious way to making genuine preparations for a possible general war with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, a week ago, there was a lot of talk about, is there a new Cold War? But it was with China. This week, it's been rather different. But on the question of European security, there's never been such a thing as an organized European security policy. It's one of the mythical unicorns that people have been waiting for since 1948, basically, that Europeans would pull together. The European Union has been coming apart at the seams over the last decade over issues of immigration, nationalism, tolerance, diversity, protection of rights, and so forth. This is, as what Philip Zelikow said, this is a new world order, is exactly right. Those issues are now going to pale in comparison to the prospect of having a cruise missile launched onto Paris or London, which is a remote but not impossible possibility. So we are in a moment of completely rethinking the way that Europe has acted or not acted adequately in the last few decades.
I want to stress, I don't actually like people who talk about new Cold War 2.0. I actually don't care for that one because I think it actually tends to close thought and makes people think, oh, we know what to do here. Yes. We do that. This is different. And actually Russians that I know, Andrei Kortunov earlier today makes the point, and others, there are aspects of this that are actually more dangerous than the Cold War year.
Yeah. Look, I have to, it's 6:30 and it's been 90 minutes. There are a lot of you here who have to go on to next things. You can come down and talk to the panelists, but I think we should give them all a round of applause. Thank you.